Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. It's quite an honor and privilege to be here at the Clinton School of Public Service. And given some of my comments on TV during the 2016 presidential campaign, I'm surprised they didn't have some security at the door to detain me for a couple minutes. In all seriousness, Skip, thank you for having me. The fact that we can have a civil policy discourse in this country is what makes it so special. I've admired the job that you've done here in accomplishing that and furthering that with this institution. I also be remiss if I didn't mention Blake Rutherford, who is a good friend and also a law partner of mine, and we're happy to have him and Jess and stolen them away to Philadelphia, and hope they stay. He's a thought leader in his own right on the Democratic side of the aisle. We have some pretty spirited discussions and actually spent election night together, and we thought that was going to go a whole different way. And we had a whole plan. That plan got blown up within a few hours. But we're lucky to have him as one of the partners at our firm, and we're lucky to have he and his wife in Philadelphia as Philadelphians. The topic tonight is Trump and the courts. It's a pretty broad topic, especially we talk about Trump and the courts, and folks chuckle a little bit. Everything we talk about on CNN, Robert Mueller, the Stormy Daniels, Giuliani this past week, all the things that are going on. I spend most of my time talking about that stuff on TV, but tonight I have an opportunity to talk about the courts and the good work that's been done by the White House Counsel's office and this administration on the courts. It's not something that's covered by cable TV, but certainly very, very important. I feel like I was ground zero at that effort in the White House Counsel's office, and it was January 19th, not January 20th, 2017, Don McGahn, the White House Counsel, had pulled us all into the Jones Day conference room. And it was a group of about 25 lawyers this is the group that was going to make up the White House Counsel's office, and pulled us into I was a little apprehensive. I am not a creature of Washington, D.C. I was the lawyer to the governor in Pennsylvania. I served in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Pennsylvania. I've been in a Philadelphia law firm. Majority of my career was my first entree down to Washington, other than working on the presidential transition team, into Washington politics and everything that goes on down there. So I was a little apprehensive. And going into that meeting, you look around the room, Don asked each and every one of us to introduce ourselves, tell everybody around the room what we had done. And of the 25 people in that room, just less than half of them had been United States Supreme Court clerks. Scalia, Thomas, Kennedy, Alito. One fella that I work with was an Alito clerk, and he also worked for a circuit judge by the name of Neil Gorsuch. So you look around the room, and then you have a bunch of folks who are also circuit court clerks, Department of Justice, Hill experience. They knew their way around the Hill. They knew their way around the agencies. And that's when it really became clear to me what the priority of that office was going to be on a day-to-day basis. Confirm judges, push forward reg reform. And that's what we did. Of that core team, there's been a pretty impressive group that have moved on to do some other things in government. One's the U.S. Attorney in the Western District of Texas. The other one's Senior Counsel at the SEC. One heads the Antitrust Division at the Department of Justice, and one was just confirmed to the D.C. Circuit. So taking one of our own and getting him through the confirmation process. On the courts, real success. Within weeks of coming into office, January 31st, we had the nomination for an Associate Justice to the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch. And I was sitting in my office in EEOB along with Stefan Passantino, who's also the ethics counsel in the office, and we had that in our portfolio. He head up the ethics effort for the White House. And a fellow walks into our office and said, "Hey, I was sent over here, I got to talk to you guys." And it's Neil Gorsuch walking into the room. And I wanted to pinch myself at that moment, because at that moment, I realized that what we were doing was making history. And that kind of brought it all home as to why I left Philadelphia, left my family at home during the week, spent those long hours, because you're really able to impact what's going on in this country. the announcement was that evening in the East Room. And just to bring it into perspective for you, when I walked along the walkway at the Rose Garden, I stopped for a moment and saw the Washington Monument, and I took a photo of it. And it was at that point that the Secret Service came up and told me I can't take any photos there. I had no idea that I wasn't even allowed to do that at that point in time. So he didn't take the photo, he didn't make me delete it from my camera. That's a keeper. That happens to be the same night that Neil Gorsuch gets announced and I actually get a photo of the monument from the Rose Garden. But from that point on, it was all hands on deck. We went back to the offices that night. The binders were put together. Every legal issue that he had ever touched gets vetted through a process. Immediately start working on the Hill. The ethics folks do what they're doing. There's war room, there's prepping. And then you get to confirmation day and getting him ready for the hearings. And we had a war room set up at EEOB for that. And then you get to confirmation day. And it was satisfying for everybody that had a little piece of it. And I just had a little piece of it. And that evening, we took a little break to celebrate in the Truman Bowling Alley in the White House, and we had a special guest. It wasn't the then confirmed Associate Justice, it was the Vice President. And that's a moment that I'm always going to treasure as well, because you don't get those moments to kind of relax and have a pizza party in the White House bowling alley all that often to celebrate something like that, and then turn around and go back to your office and work for the rest of the night. Since then, the president's nominated 137 judicial candidates. 39 of the nominees have been confirmed by the Senate. 30 in the circuit courts, 30 nominations, 15 confirmations. On the district courts, 83 nominations, 17 confirmations. This was done at record pace, and I know the president say this is the biggest, the best, the most important, and the most. Well, this one is the most, and it really was a testament to the work that went into it by the folks in that office, all of those former clerks doing the vetting, all of those former folks that used to work on the Hill, working the Hill, everybody working in concert with one another to get, folks through that confirmation process. It's really tough. It's a really tough process. My piece of it, the other day, I had a distinct honor of being invited to the investiture of Judge Stephanos Bibas for the Third Circuit of Philadelphia. He's in his early 40s. He's a former Penn Law professor, and wasn't someone who worked in the political circles. So it took some work getting him, to get to know the folks in the political circles. But I think that his nomination, is indicative of what this administration's trying to do, which is shape the courts for the next 40 years. You have a judge now on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, very accomplished professor, got the support, at least got the blue slip of the United States Senator on the Democratic side, and the full support of our senator in Pennsylvania, of course, the Republican senator in Pennsylvania, of course. And, my part in helping get him through that process, is my piece that can help shape the courts for the next 40 years as well. So that, transitioning, I want to transition to reg reform in a second, but the judges is something you're going to see time and time again. You're going to hear more and more about it. We've got a lot of the nominations in queue. The president has nominated some very, very qualified, especially to the circuit court, judges who are going to have impeccable reputations in their home communities and their home legal communities, and are conservative judges. On reg reform, the White House Counsel's office is on the front lines. The president made a promise to the American people to eliminate job-killing regulations and wasteful spending. That's a political tagline. I know that. You know that. But what the office has been doing and engaging in has nothing to do with that political tagline. They're really accomplishing that goal. You have unelected bureaucrats writing hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations that have imposed civil penalties, criminal penalties, hampering business, exposing people every day to liabilities that, quite frankly, a lot of times they don't understand. And it's not to say that regulations aren't necessary. They are. They're necessary to the process. But it's not necessarily to be overburdensome and job killing. And that's something that we were working on the front lines of in the White House Counsel's office. The executive order the president signed called for a regulatory reform officer in each agency to really take a look at each agency and how they can cut regulations that are overly burdensome, don't make sense, outdated. And he said for every one new regulation, 2 have to go. And people took their jobs seriously. And they did that for every new regulation in each agency, on average, there are 22 deregulatory actions in that agency. Federal agencies achieved over $8 billion in lifetime net regulatory cost savings and $570 million per year. Important there is what the White House counsel's role is and all that. Each one of us had most of us had liaison responsibilities to the agencies. I had the General Services Administration and the Department of Transportation because I had experience in that. We had folks who had a regulatory background in environment and energy, working with the Department of Interior and the Energy Regulatory Agency, Department of the Interior, the Department of the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Environmental Regulatory Agencies. That's the role of those lawyers, communicating on issues that have White House equities with their counterparts in the agencies, the general counsels in the agencies, to work on regulatory reform, and then bring that back home with the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Nobody even ever heard of that agency, but that's the agency that shepherds through the regulatory review process at the White House. It's called OIRA, and there was a lawyer specifically staffed to work with OIRA on those issues. So that's just a piece of what we do. But I think in terms of a legacy for the president and a legacy for Don McGahn, it's an important one, and I think it's going to be a lasting one. And with all the things that go on in terms of regulatory reform, with those types of actions comes litigation. And the White House counsel's office, while they don't represent the federal government in litigation, the Department of Justice does that. To the extent there are White House equities and the White House has a stake in a particular piece of litigation, they are overseeing and working in concert with the Department of Justice on those issues. The days of sue and settle are over. The days of in the Obama administration when something couldn't get passed through a legislative agenda, the activist groups would bring suit and the suit would get settled, and you would have, binding agreements upon an agency to do something that couldn't be done legislatively. That's done for. We don't do that anymore. This administration has focused on, working closely with the agencies to make sure that the rule of law is being followed. And everybody throws out the rule of law as kind of it's another political tagline now. Democrats are now using it, that we have to, hold, the Democratic attorney generals are saying we have to hold this administration accountable. We have to bring lawsuits. It's the same thing the Republicans were saying in the last administration. But in this instance, the rule of law, meaning, that we're not do by executive order what we couldn't otherwise do by legislation or executive or by, but we would be prohibited from doing by through the executive powers, and that we couldn't get done through the legislative agenda, just willy-nilly going out and doing it because we can, and then letting the courts figure it out. That's not something we seek to engage in, but with that comes litigation. So we've been seeing litigation on everything from the Clean Power Plan to the Department of Education and what they've done with private institutions, to immigration and what has happened with immigration. And the White House counsel's office is on the tip of the spear on those issues while not going to court. So I wanted to at least give you a flavor for what goes on day to day, what folks work on in the White House counsel's office, in addition to dealing with the daily firestorms, right? So we have, the president communicates directly to his base through his Twitter account, and by virtue of getting up in the morning and tweeting a couple of words, your day can get changed in a moment. So all these things we're working on, these great things we're working on, getting judges confirmed and other things, can get derailed, sometimes for the benefit of the American people, sometimes just as a distraction to your day, depending upon what the issue is. But just in the day, remember, 25 lawyers in the White House counsel's office. And if one of his tweets touches one of your issues, it can spark a chain reaction of meetings that take place until about 2:30 in the afternoon when the press secretary has to do her briefing. And then you start your day of working on reg reform and some of the other things that you had intended on working on that day. We were just talking about that a moment ago in the back. But I like to freewheel a little bit, so I'm sure everyone has questions about the Trump administration, what goes on. There's a little palace intrigue. I'm happy to have that discussion. So why don't I just open it up for questions, and we'll...
Okay, we got questions right here. There's one right back here. Raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you.
You mentioned regulatory reform. Something that seems to come up each election cycle is tort reform. Do you have any insight about that in this next cycle?
I haven't seen that as something that's been a tremendous priority at the federal level. Sure, it comes up. The frivolous lawsuits come up. Republicans talk about frivolous lawsuits. Democrats talk about, access to justice. It's certainly something that I believe needs to be addressed. I'm not sure that it needs to be addressed at the federal level, but not something that I've seen pushing forward as an administration priority, if that's your question. I think everybody recognizes that something needs to be done. I just don't know that, it's not taking front and center stage at this point.
So what type of involvement has Donald Trump's sister had in nominations?
To my knowledge, none. But for those of you who don't know, Donald Trump's sister is a federal judge. But to my knowledge, none. And I wouldn't be privy to the conversation between the president and his sister anyway. But to my knowledge, that there is a formal interview process. The senators are involved, and for those of you who don't know, for the district court judges, typically what happens is the senators from each particular state come to have an interview process of their own in state. And they will make recommendations to the White House counsel's office. Obviously, it's the prerogative of the president to nominate, but there has been a long-standing tradition that the senators will make those recommendations to the White House counsel's office, and then the president will act upon the recommendation of the White House counsel's office after there have been discussions with the local senators. And that's been the long-standing traditional process in terms of nominating judges. And there's an extensive interview process in between times that involves folks from the Department of Justice, folks from the White House counsel's office, and it's quite a group of lawyers who are sitting across the table from each one of those candidates, really hammering away on the questions. The Q&A is pretty tough.
Yes, you got a question right here.
I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that judge approval process in the Senate. If the senators propose those judges, then how do you go to the Senate and persuade both parties that those judges are acceptable to be approved, both Democrats and Republicans?
A lot of that is, in terms of the recommendations from the Senate, and there are folks that come up through out of the states directly. There's a number of different avenues that the nominations take place, but the tradition has been that the senators from each state will agree upon, a slate of candidates or a particular candidate even. If you have a Democratic and a Republican senator, a lot of times they'll come to agreement on a particular opening in their state. In Pennsylvania, for instance, we have a commission, and Senator Toomey and Senator Casey have appointees who serve on that commission, and it evaluates they meet from quarterly or something like that, and they evaluate resumes as they come in, invite people in for interviews, ultimately make a recommendation to the senators as to who they believe are the most qualified candidates, and then the senators will then take that under advisement in making their recommendations from their states for the particular judges. Might not be the same way in Arkansas, but that's how we do it in Pennsylvania.
Yes, sir.
You may not be able to answer this. What I'm trying to figure out is the president ran on 2 or 3 big legislative issues, and just 2 that we've gone through have been tax reform and health care reform. Does this office that you worked in get involved in that at all, or is there an office in the White House that seems to have some involvement in it? Because what we're seeing sometimes in the paper is that it's a responsive rather than an active.
No, there's a lot. It's kind of like the duck on the water, right, with the feet going underneath. There are a number of folks who have tasks at hand as it relates to a particular legislative item. The drafting piece, the working with the agencies and getting their input on particular legislation. Certainly the lawyers are going to factor into and be consulted on the drafting piece of it as it relates to what we want, meaning the administration wants out of the legislature and the Congress on a particular issue. Then we have a group of legislative affairs team who their job is to basically sell the sausage to the Congress and get there and push and lobby for the president's agenda as it relates to the House and the Senate. And there's also a group, if it's a domestic policy issue, for instance, healthcare, the Domestic Policy Council, which is an office within the White House that's been in many prior White Houses, weighs in from a policy perspective on whatever issue is at hand. A perfect example of that would be healthcare falls well within the policy area of Domestic Policy Council. The tax reform was really spearheaded by the National Economic Council and the team within Gary Cohn's group.
Yes, sir. Got a question.
Looking around the room, I know there are a number of lawyers that have supervised large numbers of attorneys, and the general thought is whip them into a frenzy, point them in a direction, and let them go. How was supervision handled? I think you said 25 lawyers that were dealing with the DREG. How was supervision handled? Because occasionally you're going to have somebody that's not pulling their weight or heading down the wrong track. Would you describe the supervisory process that y'all had?
Well, with this group, you didn't have anyone who wasn't pulling their weight. I mean, you had a tremendous group of ambitious lawyers, and these folks were in here for a purpose, and they came in to accomplish that. Whatever their goals were, whatever the goals of the president. We're all there to accomplish the goals of the president, but they wanted to come in and work on those issues that were important to them. So you don't really have that issue of trying to motivate people. Don did a very good job at selecting the lawyers on that team, and nobody required any prodding, I can tell you that. We had regular meetings, White House Counsel's office meetings, and talked about the issues, gave briefings on a particular topic among us, talked through the issues, a couple of times a week.
So let's see if somebody else has a question that doesn't. Has anybody else? You want to ask one?
Oh, right. I forgot. Jim, I thought it might be helpful if you talked a little bit about the specific relationship between Don McGahn and President Trump. How does that relationship function? How essential is it to the core operations of the White House? And I know you stay in close contact with Don, so I thought you offered palace intrigue. I've got 25 more questions about that, but let's start with this one, because I still think there's often some curiosity of who does the White House Counsel represent, what's the relationship to the president, so on and so forth.
So the White House Counsel represents the White House as an institution. The Office of White House Counsel does not represent the president in his personal capacity. He has private lawyers to do that. And then he also has lawyers that represent his campaign, and there are lawyers that represent his businesses. So the president has a lot of lawyers. But in this, to answer your question, Blake, in our role, we represent the president in his capacity as president. Now, going into the relationship between the White House counsel and the president, that's obviously a very, very important one. There are very few people who report directly to the president. The White House counsel is one of them. And the president has to have confidence in his lawyer, and the lawyer has to have confidence in the client as well. And I think McGahn and Trump, the president, developed that relationship during the campaign where Don McGahn was his lawyer. I wouldn't read too much into the news stories. I hate to use the term fake news, but anytime that obviously there's going to be from time to time, there's going to be arguments and disagreements among principals in any government operation. I was the lawyer to a governor. I had disagreements with the governor from time to time. And if someone was leaking every time we had a disagreement, it would land in a newspaper, and people would talk about, well, he's leaving, or he's not happy with the governor. I mean, that could happen. That would happen in politics in this day and age with the 24-hour news cycle. That's going to happen to anyone. So I wouldn't put too much stock in the reports that that the White House counsel's unhappy with the president's unhappy with the White House counsel. I can tell you in this instance, this White House counsel was well respected throughout that building and was a person who brought great stability to that office and that operation, and that's the job of the lawyer. It's not to be excitable. It's not to go up and down. It's to give good legal advice to the client, and that's what Don does.
Hey, Jim, having lived through Ken Starr, how much oxygen in the room does the Mueller investigation? I know that that's not the White House, McGahn's job and all that stuff, but in terms of just getting things done, getting people's attentions, getting people's responsiveness, because during the Starr years, it was pretty consuming. So
you know this. There's only so much bandwidth in an office, right? And whether it's the White House counsel's office, the press shop, the staff secretary, whatever the office is within the White House, is going to be strained day to day when you're taking incoming from the news media on any particular issue that is not forwarding the agenda of the administration. And that's the struggle. The office is not. There is not unlimited resources in the White House. There are roughly 120 commissioned officers, give or take 120 commissioned officers, who are people that are appointed by the president to positions within the White House. There are staff that work under those commissioned officers and alongside those commissioned officers, but the folks who are day-to-day responsible for running the White House office is about 120 people. That's not all that many people. So, and there's only so much bandwidth to go around. So when something pops during the day, certainly it's going to impact your ability to move an agenda forward. But I think, by and large, if the issue that pops during the day doesn't affect you, you're going to continue to grind through on whatever it is you're working on. So, the Mueller investigation isn't impacting the people that are working on, things that don't touch congressional oversight, for instance, because that, when I say the Mueller investigation, we can talk about that in the context of the Senate and the House investigations as well that are making inquiries to the White House, and the White House lawyers are responsible for, White House lawyers are responsible for responding to those inquiries.
yes, Josh.
One thing that's been interesting to me is that President Trump has been appointing judges at a far faster rate than President Obama did, even though the latter is a former constitutional law professor. And I'm curious as to why you think that is the case. I'm sure there are lots of different explanations. One of them might be that the Obama administration was consumed with the financial crisis in 08-09, but I'm just generally interested in your thoughts as to why the Trump administration has been so much more focused on appointing judges and has been more effective at it than the Obama administration was as of this point in their administrations.
I think the answer to that is Don McGahn. I mean, you have a White House counsel who is making it a strong priority for the office. Just because you have other policy issues of the day. I mean, the Obama administration was dealing with the financial crisis. The Trump administration is dealing with North Korea. That's not slowing us down from appointing judges. So I think it's less about. I think it's more about who's driving it. And in this case, McGahn's been driving it with the authorization of the president to do so. It's a priority.
Yes, so here we-
Further to Skip's comment about oxygen in the room, is everyone holding their breath to find out when Justice Kennedy is going to move along?
I don't know that anyone's holding their breath. I think there's a lot of speculation out there whether Justice Kennedy's going to step down or not. I don't think we can go about our day worrying about whether he's going to do that or not. I think the White House should be focused on now the circuit court judges and the district court judges. And if something happens that a position opens up, it'll be all hands on deck again, just like it was back in January, where we're working around the clock to try to get it across the finish line.
Question, somebody else have one? Was there a hand in the middle? Yes, hi Stacy, let me get this.
You mentioned 25 lawyers, and sounds like they're long hours, probably make more money out in the private sector.
Oh, yeah.
Do most of the attorneys come and stay for the term of the administration, or do they turn over?
Very few. So we had a wide range of experience, right? We had a group of 30-somethings, a few of us in our 40s, and a few in the 50s. So everybody's in different stages of their career, right? So I'm in my 40s, so I have been in and out of government my entire career. When I took the job, I had a discussion with Don as to how long I could stay. And he was appreciative of the time that I was willing to give to him and to the government and to the American people to serve. Everybody has their own family situation at home. In terms of the hour, I think it's more driven. I mean, you're leaving your family, you're leaving, no matter whether you live in the district or you live in Philadelphia, you're leaving your family for a large chunk of time. And that's difficult. So the answer to your question is hardly anyone stays 4 years. Hardly anyone stays longer than 18 months in these jobs, at least in the White House, in the senior White House counsel position, in the White House counsel positions. They may go on to other government jobs. I listed off some of the things that other folks in the office have done, which are just incredible. But by and large, folks stay 18 months, 18 months, 2 years, and then move on. That's pretty typical.
Other questions? Yes, sir, right here.
Yeah, when it comes to offering legal advice to the president, what is the relationship between the Office of the Counselor and the Attorney General?
They have different jobs. So the White House Counsel gives legal advice to the president. The Attorney General runs the Department of Justice of the United States. Now, there is a considerable overlap, especially it relates to the Office of Legal Policy at the Department of Justice. That's legal policy. They work closely with the White House Counsel's office on those issues. But as it relates to independent lawsuits that don't have White House equities, they just run their course. It's not the Attorney General's job to necessarily give legal advice to the president. That's the job of the White House Counsel. The Attorney General represents the United States government as it relates to matters that are brought against the United States government or where the United States government in general is asking for legal advice. So there's some overlap there, but in particular, the day-to-day decision-making of the president and the legal implications of that fall largely upon the White House Counsel's office. Now, the White House Counsel's office may seek an opinion from the Department of Justice because those opinions carry legal significance and legal weight and precedence and are precedent setting in some instances. So there's a lot of interplay there. But the person walking into the president's office and giving him advice on a day-to-day basis on legal issues is the White House Counsel, not the Attorney General.
Yes, Mary. She's got it right. She's great.
Can you speak to the Trump administration's decision to not give their list of judicial nominees to the ABA to evaluate prior to making their nominees public?
Yes, but I'm thinking about my answer, so give me a second. The answer to that question is it's the White House counsel's, it's the White House's decision as to who they rely upon in making their determinations as to who good judges are or not. And for reasons that, I can't discuss, they decided not to, pre-vet those with the American Bar Association. And I will speak as Jim Schultz right now, not speaking on behalf of the administration. Every one of these organizations, whether it's the Pennsylvania Bar Association, the Arkansas Bar Association, all have their own small plea political process, right? So Jim Schultz speaking now on behalf of the administration, I think it's a good thing that the administration have its own process, that it doesn't, that power vests to appoint Article III judges in the president, not in any bar association. And there's no reason why the president needs to take direction from a bar association as to who he appoints as judges, as a judge.
Jim, so you've named all these judges and a pretty success record, as Josh points out, of nominations. How do you, like in your case in Pennsylvania where your friend just got confirmed, and clearly Senator Casey supported him, how do you determine which ones you bring to the Senate? Do you work with legislative affairs? How do you do that?
He gave up his blue slip. He didn't.
Okay.
He didn't
But he didn't block him.
Right. He didn't block him.
He didn't block him. Yeah.
He didn't block him. So a lot of the work, a lot of the lifting, and it varies from administration to administration. You're going to rely a little bit upon your legislative affairs, but we had a very active White House counsel's office that had experience on the Hill. So they're going to work in concert with the Legislative Affairs Office, but those Hill meetings are going to be taken up. There will be lawyers from the White House counsel's office working hand in hand.
But if there was a particularly very controversial nomination, would you defer that one to get 9 others through that were not controversial, just get them done?
Oh, you understand. Now I understand the question. I
didn't probably
understood
right.
your question. I apologize. Sure, there are certain, I don't know that you're ever giving up any particular candidate in order to get others through. But there are certainly considerations, especially state by state, as to who you can get through and who you can't get through, and that's a political process, and that's the sausage that, the sausage making that goes on in Washington. There's, there are folks that some senators aren't going to agree to, but they may have a suggestion, and in order to get one across, you may have to take one of theirs. And that's the art of getting legislation passed or getting a judge through confirmation.
When you had the Gorsuch War Room, did you have White House Legislative Affairs and other people in there too?
Everybody was involved in that process. I mean, you had, everybody from the policy folks to the legislative affairs folks.
I have a question about the Gorsuch War Room. I'm curious about what the interactive process was with the lawyers in your office and Justice Gorsuch to prepare him for the Senate hearings. Were you sitting in a room, people taking roles of different senators, people raising different legal
That
issues?
I can't tell you. There's certain non-public information and how we went about that process. That's some of the palace intrigue that I can't get into, but it was a very well organized, well thought out process in terms of preparation, getting him ready, getting the information, understanding what the senators were going to ask, understand and anticipating those questions so that he can be prepared. It's like preparing a witness for anything else you're working on as a lawyer.
Yes, sir. Mr. Cummins, hold on here.
I think we've all seen confirmation situations where we felt like, from both sides of the aisle, that the Senate acted, in a petty way or held up a nomination that for reasons that had nothing to do with the nomination. So, I don't think I'm too far out there to say that some people would say that the Senate has too much power in the advice and consent. Having seen it as up close as you have, do you have any reasonable suggestions of how they might tweak that process in the Senate to make it a little bit more reasonable to get, presidents are entitled to get their nominees through.
Get rid of
unless
blue
there's an
slips.
articulable reason why they shouldn't. Do you have any real practical fixes that if you were king of the Senate for a minute, you might want to put in?
I'd do away with blue slips. I mean, that's really it, where, a senator turns in the blue slip to say that, to move forward on a particular judge. I'd do away with that altogether. I think that's the answer. And again, that's Jim Schultz speaking, not Trump administration. But I think that would help the process tremendously. And Bud Cummins is with us. You probably all know him, but I got to know him last summer in 2016, working on the transition together, and he's become a friend over time. So, Bud, thanks for coming. I didn't see you sitting there. I would acknowledge you in the beginning.
You made it back, Bud. We're glad to have you. Any other questions? Well, let's thank Jim Schultz for being here. And please come visit with him one-on-one. Please come talk to him. Thanks. Thank you.